All right, hi guys. It is I. Let me just make sure this recording is going. I think we are. Yeah, good. Okay. So welcome. I'm recording this on Wednesday. Usually would do this the day before and it would have been posted already, but I found out about the move to remote on a little bit later yesterday than I would have preferred. So than I think all of us would have preferred, but we're figuring it out. So, by the way, I have my Bruce tartan bow tie on. Okay. I think that's pretty cool. If you don't, then I don't have to hear from you because this is a recording, so I guess it won't matter. So yeah, what we're gonna do, the idea is apparently for the moment is that perhaps we'll be remote at least through Friday, but there's at least a chance we'll be back on our schedule for Monday with the in-class. So we'll see, guys. I don't know. I mean, at this point, everything is just so nuts. So I don't know what to expect anymore. It's been quite a hectic week. A lot of stuff going on. We had to put our 19-year-old kitty down yesterday because she just wasn't recovering from some of her ailments. And anyway, so that was rough. Then campus is shut down. Now we're doing remote learning again, which is a lot more time consuming, but we'll get it done. So that's kind of where we are. I want you guys to just stay on track with the course calendar for submission. So I don't think the reality of our our present struggles with on campus. I'm tempted to say some stuff, but I won't. From all indications, the uptick of cases on Corbin's campus are at least partially due to some carelessness regarding social interactions and norms and stuff, and it's just frustrating. There are consequences to not following all the rules, and here we are. So we'll hope that the consequences are minimal and we're able to get back to it on Monday. That'd obviously be the preference. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to walk us through a few more things regarding, the onset of the war. I actually am going to cover a couple more things in Europe before I transition over to Asia. So let me get to. So I did find some. I actually found the presentation I thought I was using and transferred it on over. So, we were talking about Munich last week, and this is the photograph I usually use with the caption. You can see. So in the photo here, you've got Hitler at the center, obviously, and to his right is Neville Chamberlain. As this photo represents the infamous Munich conference with the appeasement process that occurred afterwards. So just a very frustrating reality as we come out of Munich. And then, you see the partitions that take place in Czechoslovakia and Poland in 1938 and 1939. The Anschluss, the move into Austria, also takes place in 1938. So we worked through the buildup of the German war machine, and we need to spend some time talking about a couple of other things. I'm going to come back and talk about the Holocaust actually not today, but I'll probably do that either Friday or Monday. I haven't determined which day that will be for, but we are obviously going to talk a little bit about the Holocaust. So we worked through the onset of the war in Eastern Europe and the decisions to try to hold the East while the German onslaught in the West took place. And the idea was, of course, to topple France and then to hopefully topple the United Kingdom, to topple the British and take them out of the war early on as well. And that very well could have happened in 1940. And we just talked about the other day, we talked about the fact that ultimately the British are able to hold them from taking Britain. This is a photo I wanted you to see. We talked about the Battle of Britain, the Blitz, and ultimately the Battle of Britain that takes place in the fall of 1940. So the Blitz is happening already in the spring of 1940 on through the summer, and then you have this infamous culmination, the Battle of Britain, that's taking place. So it's really over about a 6 or 7 month time span that, you know, the intense German campaigns are taking place to try to soften Britain up for an invasion. And I just think it's helpful to see. This is London, about a block and a half or two from Piccadilly, so right in the heart of London itself. And it's just a reminder that wartime Britain sees these civilians, and especially many of these southern towns in England itself, they are experiencing not just some some fringe elements of German air campaigns. They're taking the brunt of this. And the Allies will ultimately respond, of course, as I'll be talking about here, but it really helps us, I think, to understand that, you know, World War II is certainly fought on battlefields, but some of those battlefields include an awful lot of civilians, and they were dying in droves. That's certainly true with the Brits, especially those in places like London itself, Dorsetshire, some of the other regions in southern England. So, very important moment that I wanted to touch on. Of course, the United States remains formally neutral throughout the year 1940 and into 1941. There is a famous charter I want you to at least be aware of. It's signed in 1941, August of 1941, called the Atlantic Charter. And this is between the United States and Britain. Just a reminder that our two countries, by the 1940s in particular, I would say that most historians regard the British as our closest allies in the war for a lot of different reasons. There's also a healthy amount of respect and friendship between FDR and Winston Churchill. So they had a pretty close bond as leaders and friends. That is also very helpful. And essentially, Churchill, all along, he'd been begging for the United States to begin to help the Brits as the war is heating up. And when it breaks out in 1939, it's important to know that the United States was, you know, there had been a number of neutrality acts passed in the mid to late 1930s that restricted some measure of U.S. support. So Roosevelt found some other interesting ways to try to get the Brits some of the implements that they really needed in 1941. Lend-Lease is certainly one of those elements. The Lend-Lease Act, the Atlantic Charter established this this coalition with some specific provisions outlined for the two countries to aim for as they sought to bring about resolution to the war in Europe. So the Atlantic Charter is something that actually helps to open up the windows of opportunity as far as formally supporting one another. And this is before Pearl Harbor. So actually Roosevelt took some heat for signing the Atlantic Charter from a fair contingent of US citizens in the late summer of 1941. So here's what I want to do. I want to explain a couple of other campaigns and then talk to you guys for a brief time. I can't spend too much on it in this class because it is, after all, modern East Asia, but I do want to talk a little bit about signal intelligence. But before we get there, I'll talk about aircraft. There we go. So the Allied air campaigns. So from 1942 on through the end of the war, we have, there are some immensely important Allied air campaigns that are taking place. The United States becomes, an integral part of these daylight bombing campaigns. And And here, I just want to mention a couple of things about how they were originally formatted, and then I will come back a little bit later when we get to 1944 and 1945. Actually, 1943 is where I'll start, late 43. And I'll explain some of the lessons that were learned and some of the differences that are applied in those later campaigns. At the beginning of the Allied air campaign, so this is primarily in Europe we're talking about, of course, we're talking about the British and the American air forces. The United States actually takes the brunt of responsibility for probably about 65% of the air campaigns in 1940, late 42 and on into 1943. The Brits are still doing bombing runs, but they have a number of the British aircraft are deployed in the Southern Theater for a time, so in the Mediterranean Theater. So in 1942 and 43, the United States is actually responsible for a fair amount of these air campaigns. These are, these strategic bombing campaigns are geared, of course, toward trying to find ways to limit Germany's combat production, its factory productions, also trying to limit some of the arsenals, the military arsenals, the highways, the railroads, things along those lines. And they're meant to strike in the heart of Germany. And so these bombing campaigns, they're taking off in southern Britain, flying over the Channel and over Germany proper. And they're doing this at daytime because precision bombing cannot take place at night. They do not have the technological capacity to do that. And so these are, the effort is to be as precise as possible. You do understand, though, that in the 1940s, we're not dealing with, infrared radar technology. We're not dealing with the kinds of locational devices that we have on modern aircraft, and so they're not going to be quite as pinpoint accurate. But still, the goal was to to hit priority targets, not to just literally wipe entire towns and villages off the map. The reality, of course, is that in some cases you just have massive destruction and what is sometimes referenced as collateral damage, because we're dealing with these massive air formations dropping gigantic bomb loads on these territories and specific targets in Germany. These bomber aircraft, this one happens to be probably the most prominent of the American bomber craft used, the Flying Fortress. There were other bombers used in both the European theater and the Pacific theater by the Americans, but the B-17 is a huge workhorse, so I'm using it as an example. Pretty phenomenal aircraft for its time. But one of the things that you deserve to know here is that the experience of these daylight bombing campaigns was about as demoralizing as you can possibly imagine in 1942 and on into 1943. And one of the reasons is that these bomber squadrons, they only had partial escorts. So the P-47s that were being flown and some of the British aircraft, including including the Spitfire, they had a very limited range. So these bomber crews were flying from southern Britain over their targets, typically in Germany itself, and then all the way back to the airfields in southern Britain. So for most of that round trip, they were not able to experience the coverage and the assistance, the defensive assistance from escort fighters. Because there just wasn't anything that could take them all the way to their targets and bring them all the way back home. And so, for hundreds of miles to their target and hundreds of miles back, these bomber formations were just open to German fighter aircraft who came up and just made these Allied bomber formations pay a huge price. Here's an example of the B-17's ball turret underneath the aircraft. One of the craziest jobs you can probably imagine. They had to get a really small guy to fit in there to begin with. So usually the guys in the ball turret guns were, like 5'4" and 5'5", 5'6", something like that. 120, 30 pounds, something like, something along those lines. A very, very cramped space to be in. 50 cal Browning machine guns is pretty good armament, but this is an extremely exposed position underneath the aircraft. And, the guys that took these assignments often, they became pretty easy targets for the German air crews. And we're primarily dealing, when we talk about the German air crews that are coming up to hit these bomber squadrons, we're primarily talking about the Messerschmitt, the Me-109, one of the great fighter aircraft, one of the greatest of all fighter aircraft in the mid part of the 20th century. A little bit difficult to fly at first, but experienced pilots got every ounce out of this aircraft they possibly could. Very good armament, very, very maneuverable. It ultimately, the only limitation the Me-109s experienced was their engines, if they went above about 40,000 feet or so, they had some trouble, especially when they got to those altitudes. And there were a couple of other minor limitations, but a very effective aircraft, and even more so if they had an effective German pilot, one who was highly trained. Later on in the war, the Me-109 squadron suffered a lot more because they did not have pilots who were used to the equipment and had not flown enough hours in the Me-109s and didn't know how to handle them in a crisis as well. But these are very effective aircraft, and they punished these Allied bomber formations, especially in 1942 and 43. So when those bombers groups came over these German military sites and even, of course, civilian centers like Berlin, man, these Me-109 squadrons came up and just pounded them. And the Allies lost an awful lot of bomber aircraft because of their severe lack of, as I said, their severe lack of escort fighters. So I'm not going to deal with the escort fighters yet, because we're going to come back and talk about them when we're dealing with the air campaigns in 44 and 45. But I wanted you to be aware that this is happening in 42 and 43, okay? Now, we do have to talk about signal intelligence. And this is a conversation that in my military history class that I once taught when we had more history faculty, and we were able to teach not only the gen ed but a broader range of specialized courses. I used to teach an American military history class, and in that class, I got to spend a fair amount of time during the Second World War trying to cover the ins and outs of SIGINT, or signal intelligence. And I just cannot really dig into a whole lot of this today, but I do at least want to walk you through some rudimentary components. So when the war breaks out in the 1930s, when the Germans are prepping for the invasion of Poland, the invasion ultimately takes place, of course, in September of 1939. And right before Poland falls, they were able to get a Polish copy of the German coding device, so the Enigma coding machine. The Polish group headed by Marian Rejewski, here is his name. Marian, by the way, is a very, very common European male name in the early part of the 20th century and through most of the centuries. So I know that seems like an odd name for a guy, but it was actually quite common. So Rejewski's crew had created a very, very capable copy of a German Enigma device, a 3-rotor German Enigma machine. This is the Enigma solved by Rejewski's team, and a version of this copy made by the Poles was smuggled out of Poland right before the German invasion, or shortly before the German invasion, and it ended up in Britain, just outside of Whitehall, at a place called Bletchley Park. And this guy here, Alan Turing, and his team, Turing, an Oxford mathematician of note, actually I think Cambridge mathematician of note, who was utilized by the British government by its its intelligence organizations during the Second World War, to head up this code breaking apparatus at Bletchley Park. And they made it their business to crack the 3 and 4 and a few 5 rotor varieties of the German coding devices, the Enigma machines. And I'm not going to go through all the processes here, but if these coding machines were operated correctly, they were virtually unbreakable. But the whole thing boiled down to whether the German soldier, the German officer typically, who was sending and receiving the codes through these machines, they had to use the proper coding process. And too many Germans began to get lazy with the coding process, and that laziness, for instance, like using their given name instead of a coded identity during transmission, ultimately gave guys like, the Bletchley Park crews what's called a crib, a way to break through the code process and begin to disrupt the codes and unearth them, I should say. So Bletchley Park is responsible for breaking a number of critical German codes throughout the war. It's not the only agency working, but it becomes assuredly the most important. And what happens is Turing and his crew begin to invent machines, code-breaking machines, that help them to get through the process of breaking these codes and in their cryptanalysis, to get through the process much, much, much faster. So it's not like they're doing this by hand. These machines are invented by Turing in particular to help this process go along much more smoothly. The most impressive machine that he develops is called the Cyclops. Or not the Cyclops. I've been teaching Greece and Rome too long. It's called Colossus. So the Colossus is a machine that Turing invents, and it helps when they're trying to break through the codes by doing these priority markers for each element of a code, and then it would flag something and bring up a light that would help the code breaking crews make a match as they were going through these codes. Still a pretty complex process, but it was sped up immensely by code breaking machines like Colossus. So back to Turing for a second. Very interesting guy. I won't go into his bio for you here. Just very eccentric, as many geniuses tend to be. And I would say that Turing is one of the most important individuals when it comes to the to the Allied code breaking process. A lot of the stuff that Bletchley does, they feed that information to their counterparts in the United States in places like Washington, D.C. So the Bletchley crews are instrumental in helping to break through those German codes, particularly with the Enigma coding devices. There are other groups that the Allies that should be mentioned that the Allies are using. There's a group as I said, in Washington, D.C. There's another group out at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. There's another British group in New Zealand and Australia that's part of a pretty massive code-breaking apparatus. And what you need to understand is that really, like no other time in the history of warfare, has the code-breaking apparatus been so incredibly well structured and the information so heavily and carefully guarded. And there really is no comparison to how effective the code-breaking apparatus was for the Allies in World War II. So, a couple of things for the codes. So, broken German codes for the European crews. So, guys at Bletchley, for instance, those broken codes are typically referenced as Ultra G. So for ultra German codes. There's also a code name for broken Japanese codes. Ultra J is, these are the code breaking teams that are working on Japanese codes. There are some specialized code breaking crews. So for for one of the things that I will probably be talking about in just a bit here today. There's a crew, a combined crew. Actually, part of this was in Washington, D.C. The other crew was in New Zealand, I believe. They broke some of the Japanese codes, particularly a number of the Japanese transport codes that were instrumental by 1941 and 1942. For instance, the broken Japanese codes for transportation, which were termed to be JN25B, is the name of the Japanese broken code. So JN25B codes are really critical in allowing allies to prepare for some really unbelievably important engagements, and it gave them the upper hand. It happened at Midway, which I will get to in just a little bit. So there's another element of the code breaking process. These are broken diplomatic codes, and this was referenced through the term magic is the purple machine is sometimes what it was referenced, and magic references these broken diplomatic codes that the allies are using. Magic, these are in reference to Japanese diplomatic codes, by the way. So the entire code breaking apparatus, it's not just one organization, it's not even just one country. We're dealing with allied code breaking in the war, and it is superior, it's far superior to the Axis powers in the war, and they are offering immeasurable assistance to the allied war effort, both in Europe and in Asia, both theaters of the war. Turing's crew is certainly one of the more famous ones. So I needed you to be aware of the fact that these code breaking teams existed. It's going to help you when I explain a few things here. So going back to the North Africa campaign, and then we're going to move on to Asia and talk about them, talk about some of those campaigns in 1942 in particular. So a good example of the European code breaking apparatus, Ultra G codes that are broken. A great example of this comes in October of 42. So the United States formally enters the war after Pearl Harbor is bombed, and by spring of 1942, U.S. forces are already being deployed to Pacific and European, to both the Pacific and European theaters, and there are some critical applications. So October of 42 is technically the second battle of El Alamein, but it's the most important of the battles that take place at El Alamein in that year, and really throughout the course of the war. It is the turning point. Really, it's the kind of the gatecrasher episode where whatever Germany's initial strategic operations would have been in North Africa, these are turned back, and the Germans are forced to reorient and ultimately skip across the Mediterranean and solidify their positions in Southern Europe. And so this famous engagement that takes place in October of 1942 between Rommel's Africa Corps and a British contingent under the British General Montgomery, whose reputation is probably well known, but that's more by his own design than probably what is deserved. Nonetheless, some important things here. That battle in October of 42 between the Africa Corps and the British tank crews in North Africa is a pretty one-sided battle, and you might mistakenly assume that that's just because of maybe superior British training or superior British equipment or whatever the case may be, and that's just not at all what happened. In fact, the British tanks compared to the German tanks and the well-trained German tank crews, there really isn't much of a comparison. The British equipment was not even close to the German tanks that were in North Africa in 1942. More important than that, of course, we have the commanders, right? So the most famous commander for the Germans was Erwin Rommel, right? The Desert Fox, as he's sometimes referenced. Well, Rommel had a whole string of remarkably brilliant successes to that point in October of 42. And with the exception of maybe two minor minor skirmishes, the Africa Corps under Rommel had been running roughshod over mostly British tank crews. There were 2 engagements with some smaller American groups in August and September of 42, but most of the time this is German versus British. And Rommel's armored cavalry, as we now call it, his armor, they were just running roughshod over the Brits and embarrassing them in battle after battle. So how does this change? How does this get reversed in a culminating and absolutely critical battle just to the west of the Nile River Delta? So this was Rommel's attempt to crash through the Allied lines and ultimately, force the British to reconsider their strategic and tactical operations that were being based out of, northeastern Africa, there in and around Cairo and Alexandria as well, and to force the Allies to contend with the German positions in those sectors and ultimately kind of force the issue. Well, how does this battle turn out? It ends up being this dramatic victory over the German force. So a one-sided, a lopsided British victory. And the reason is this, that the Brits knew the German order of battle prior to this engagement. That information is coming through SIGINT, specifically through Ultra G. Probably 70% of the broken codes that are used at El Alamein are coming directly from Alan Turing's Bletchley Park crew, and they have some really interesting information. So prior to the battle, the British find out that in fact Erwin Rommel will not be present for this engagement because he has just been called back to Germany. He is suffering from, of all things, a pretty horrible toothache. He needs to go to the dentist, and he's been recalled home. The German tank crews are being commanded. Three separate companies, in fact, are being commanded by very inexperienced German officers. This is something they also find out. The numbers of the German tanks, the operable German tanks, have dwindled a little bit more than the Allies were aware of. This tank force by the Germans is still a very strong one. However, it is not quite as large as they once believed. Maybe most importantly, the Allies are informed prior to the battle through the code-breaking apparatus. They know exactly which valleys the German tanks are going to be moving through. They know pretty close, in fact, to what time. They only ended up being off about 45 minutes, which is pretty impressive for when the German tank crews were going to be pouring through this valley. Sorry, this computer is now dinging and annoying me, as all technology tends to do for both Professor Scott and I. John Scott and I just love computer technology. It's so fun for historians. So the German crews move through this valley, and the Brits are waiting for them. In fact, the British tank crews are camouflaged. They're waiting in fortified positions on higher ground. They have all of their weapons zoned in, specifically ranged in on physical targets. And what I mean by physical targets is they're ranged in on topographic land formations, and they have it zoned perfectly. So they have all their range finders are perfectly ready to shoot, and they're just waiting for the German tank crews to move into the kill zones, and that's exactly what happens. And El Alamein is an all-out disaster for the Africa Corps, and the casualties are extremely high. In fact, El Alamein casualty figures are upwards of 40%. Now, remember, casualty figures, when we say that term, we're referencing both killed and wounded and missing, in fact. So there's a kind of a trinity of figures when we talk about casualties. It's not just those who are killed. But still, if you're anywhere near a 30% casualty rate in a 20th century battle, that's a bloodbath. And so this is definitely a significant victory for the Allies, and it comes, at least in large measure, it is handed to them in many respects by this absolutely spot on intelligence information that they receive. Very important. Now, there's another application that I will give you later on for SIGINT's impact in the European theater, but that comes in, comes into play during the Normandy invasion, and I don't want to get there quite yet. I want to move and talk a little bit about the Pacific in 1942 and 1943, so that we're staying a little bit more parallel and lined up. Okay, here we go. So Pearl Harbor, you guys, I don't plan on talking a whole lot about Pearl Harbor. You know that the strike on Pearl Harbor occurs in December of 1941. It is a major gamble by both Fushida, one of the flight tacticians, but of course the overall grand strategist. His plan is Isoroku Yamamoto, is the Japanese admiral. And this battle group sneaks to within about 250 miles of Pearl, and they carry out this infamous strike against the American naval crews that are present in the harbor on that Sunday morning. It is by God's grace that there is a task force, including two carriers and some battle cruisers and destroyers that are about maybe 150 miles, in fact, 150 or 200 miles southwest of Pearl, that are not present that morning. And so that actually is really important for the United States, that they were not present, that they were not damaged during the strike. That is a saving grace. But still, we all know, the strike on Pearl Harbor does obviously do a great deal of damage. It also limits the immediate capacity of the United States to respond to Japanese expansion. And this is what I want to talk about with reference to Pearl Harbor. So I'll come back and whoops, there we go. So this is, the famous strike. You got a couple of different pictures here. You see the formation of the battle groups in the harbor itself. You've got a bunch of different battleships and battle cruisers, a few destroyers on hand. And, this is the bulk of the Pacific Fleet, but it is not the entire Pacific Fleet. And lucky for us, this ends up being what we typically refer to as a tactical victory for the Japanese, but it really does not end up being a pathway to the strategic victory in the ways that the Japanese were hoping for. And one of the reasons for that is even though there were battleships that were sunk in the harbor, all but of course the battleship Arizona, which was almost completely destroyed, these battleships were recommissioned during the course of the war, and they saw actual combat duty in the war. So a lot of the ships that were at Pearl Harbor were ultimately used in combat during the course of the war itself. I think that's a really critical thing to say. What we do know is that the strike at Pearl Harbor, all along, the Japanese believed that it was essential for their further strategic operations. You see in the map here, I like this map because it's a global map and it gives you some sense of distance. So you've got Pearl Harbor over in the extreme right part of the slide. You see that there. So that attack in December of 41 was definitely a gamble, and Yamamoto understood this, even if some of the other admirals in the Japanese fleet did not. Yamamoto believed that if the strike was successful and they could get not only a number of the battleships and battle cruisers and destroyers, but critically, if they could get some of the American aircraft carriers isolated at Pearl, and they could be either destroyed or at least highly damaged, that it would secure a time frame for the Japanese. And this was the critical thing. So Yamamoto was under no, he was really not confused by some of the realities of this situation. What he hoped was that the Japanese could gain perhaps 15 to 18 months or more, but minimally 15 to 18 months before the American naval capacity in the Pacific would be capable again of striking at the Japanese fleets, who were of course going to be tasked with taking over these various island chains in the Pacific. Why do they need to be taking over the island chains? Well, of course, we've just mentioned this in the past, but I'll recenter our attention on it briefly. Because of course the Japanese home islands cannot function as any industrial nation in the mid-20th century needs to function when it's talking about imperial expansion and war. So part of this is, there's kind of a dual element. The Japanese did want to secure a barrier. You see there's this, it's technically a navy blue line, but it sort of looks like a black line. So you guys can't see me here, so I can't, it doesn't help for me to point at the slide. So if you look at the slide, you've got that black line that comes out and extends to the Aleutians on down around the Solomon Islands and back up the East Indies, etc. So that all the way around. This is a perimeter that Japan wanted to set up as a kind of a strategic barrier for their imperial conquest. And within that strategic barrier, of course, the desire was that the Japanese would be able to roam, if not completely freely, they would be able to roam without nearly as much concern, because those sectors had been essentially sealed off. And the Japanese were able to, then access these island groups and take over not only the the governments of those territories, but to essentially, colonize those territories, and then of course utilize their natural resources for Japan's own purposes. Now, of course, we've already talked about the idea that Japan sells this as part of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, and we talked about the rhetoric of that. The Japanese occupations in these countries, obviously that's highly problematic for the most part. There are some countries that welcome in the Japanese and don't seem to be that put off, but those are, exceedingly rare. Most countries, so actually in Thailand, for instance, when the Japanese came in and took over Bangkok, for instance, that reception went a lot smoother than it did in most other places. So in French Indochina, the Japanese come in and they take over Vietnam. The poor Vietnamese, if it's not bad enough they have to put up with French colonialism, then they have to put up with the Japanese occupation. This is obviously just, adding insult to injury. We've already talked about the invasion of Manchuria and Japan moving in as an occupying force in China, but you see here the sweep across the Southern Pacific as the Japanese begin to invade these island groups. So in order for the Japanese to be able to pull this off with any semblance of possibility for long-term success, the idea was that the strike at Pearl Harbor would eliminate an immediate American threat to these Japanese positions in the Western Pacific. That's the idea. Well, of course, it doesn't really quite go this way. Here's some good things for you to be aware of. So I want the striking wing for the Japanese military throughout the Second World War, the part of the Japanese military that's relied upon the most is absolutely the Imperial Japanese Navy. Obviously, there is a Japanese army and infantry units. They of course exist, and they are placed on these different island groups to defend them. But their entire support network, their rearmament, many of the critical combat campaigns that are undertaken by the Japanese hierarchy in Tokyo, they are first and foremost reliant on the Imperial Japanese Navy to carry out these edicts and to establish the perimeter of Japanese military defense during the Second World War. So it's important that you understand that that's the focal point. The army groups are, as I've just said, the army groups are placed primarily anyway, they're placed on these different island chains, and they're there for initially, of course, for conquest, in most of these island groups, there's not a whole lot of resistance that's there. The Philippines and Vietnam and ultimately China, those are the exceptions, but in many of these other island groups, the population density is actually quite limited, and the Japanese are often able to just kind of waltz on shore and begin their occupation. But the Japanese army is, of course, used for these scenarios to take the islands and then ultimately to defend them from Allied attack from both Americans and Brits and Australian forces, from all three of them, I should say. Some of the major political and military leaders, again, if this is American military history or a class on the history of World War II, I would force you guys to dig in and memorize more of these than I'm going to ask you to. There are, obviously, you do need to know several individuals. It helps you to know who the technical head of state is in Japan during the course of the Second World War. It's Emperor Hirohito. Prime Minister Tojo, right? Second from the right on the top row. And then Admiral Yamamoto, top right, very important. Minister Togo is often referenced, but I think the other, in this particular part of the war, the other commander that deserves a lot of attention is Admiral Nagano, and that attention isn't really good. Nagano was just a major league old timer. He was a dinosaur in the Japanese Admiralty by the time of the Second World War, and he proves to be a disastrous both strategist and tactician in several different campaigns, and makes some moves that cost Japan greatly. Very, very frustrating to Admiral Yamamoto. Okay, so I want to come back. Deal with two particular, one real quickly, and then I want to talk about Midway, and that'll probably get us to where we're gonna halt today. So, much to the chagrin of Yamamoto, the American forces are able to recoup. They're able to redirect their forces and redeploy their forces far more quickly than the Japanese were counting on. So the attack on Pearl Harbor takes place in December of 1941. And as you're going to see here, in the spring of 42 and the summer of 42, already there are some critical engagements between the Japanese naval forces and the American naval forces. The first of these that I can't really spend a whole lot of time on, but I just want to, I don't think I have a separate slide on it. I don't think I do. Let me see if I have Coral Sea. No. Okay, I'm going to just mention the battle, and it's a set piece really anyway for the Battle of Midway. So it's not going to be an absolute disaster that I don't have all the battle plans drawn up on screen. So there's a battle in 1942, in the late spring of 1942, called the Battle of the Coral Sea. And for us, it's just, I want to mention it to you as I segue toward the Battle of Midway. It's the first battle, one of the first battles in history, in fact, where the opposing forces, these are naval units, where the opposing ships themselves are technically engaged in combat against one another, but they are not actually seeing each other in a physical sense. They're too far apart. The Coral Sea is really one of the first important, both, it has some strategic importance, but it's in many respects, it's the tactical importance that has this legacy. And the reason is this: it's a first in a line of experiments with naval warfare in World War II that are not relying on capital ships like battleships to get within sight of one another and fire their huge guns and sink their opponents. These are carrier strike forces that are facing off against one another. So aircraft taking off from these carrier platforms and traveling, 100, 150 miles, from their carrier formations, from their carrier groups, and striking the enemy and then returning to their carriers. Both the Japanese and the American forces are carrying out these combat operations during the Battle of the Coral Sea. And both sides obviously inflict damage on the other. The Japanese have one of their carriers that's pretty highly damaged. They lose a couple of destroyers and one battle cruiser, if memory serves. The American forces also get some damage done. One of the Japanese strike forces arrives over the American fleet during a refueling operation and a rearmament operation from a supply vessel, and the Yorktown is hit. One of the American carriers, the Yorktown, is hit during the course of that process, and this gigantic hole is blown in the side of the Yorktown, and part of the deck itself is just blown to smithereens, and the Yorktown is kind of limping along. And this becomes important because of Midway, which I'll get to in a moment. But the Coral Sea, I didn't want to just get into the combat theater of World War II without at least mentioning one of these profoundly important early engagements that signify a dramatic shift in combat tactics during World War II. In World War I, for instance, and on into the first part of World War II, the thought process was that battleships were still supreme when it came to naval warfare, and that if you had a large and fast battleship with gigantic guns, capable of hunting down, being part of this hunting group to find enemy formations and to engage them, that is the most advantageous, the most critical part of your force. And yet, even in the Battle of the Coral Sea, in the very early stages of the Pacific War here, we see something very different, and that is that the carrier operations become primary, and that the striking capacity of air groups that come off these aircraft carriers and travel hundreds of miles can rain hellfire down on these enemy formations, and they can actually strike with great effectiveness even some of the largest, fastest, and best armed battleships. The Japanese learned this in a very difficult way, as do the Americans throughout the early months of World War II. And the next battle, of course, is the Battle of Midway. Midway takes place in June of 1942. We're half a year on. We're 6 months on from the bombing of Pearl Harbor. The United States has, of course, entered the war. And although the United States arsenal is not what it would be by 1943, by January of 43 and on through the rest of the war, it's already beginning to come online in very effective ways. The United States moves from a peacetime economy to a massive, booming wartime economy in shockingly fast order. It's one of the most impressive transitions in all of history, to be honest with you. And so what some have referred to at the time and since have referred to as the arsenal of democracy. A bit of a complex and problematic term, perhaps, but you get the idea. The United States moves from a peace footing to a war footing very, very quickly and very effectively. And that is already beginning to be on display in mid-1942. There are already replacement destroyers that are being sent, for instance, from both Eastern shipyards and Western shipyards out to Pearl Harbor. Aircraft industry, aircraft manufacturing for the war is already beginning to come online. There's already signs of significant aircraft development, including fighter aircraft like the P-51 Mustang that have already come through, and they're in the early stages of testing. All of these things will see service in the course of the war, and it's already being brought up to these combat applications by around mid-1942, and then moving forward. The Japanese idea here in Midway is simply this. So you see on the map, you have the Hawaiian Islands, and then directly west, you see the Midway Island chain. Really, it's Midway Island group. And the strategic importance here is that there is a U.S. air base there, and this is viewed as a striking position by the United States military. The Japanese want to reverse that. The Japanese hope is that they can actually force this situation a little bit and take Midway from the Americans, first to strike with a naval, with Japanese naval forces at American naval forces in the region. And then ultimately the desire is to deprive the Americans of the capacity to utilize Midway as this extension of their combat forces in that part of the world, in the Pacific. Unbeknownst to the Japanese, prior to the strikes that begin on June the 4th, 1942, prior to this, unbeknownst to the Japanese, American codebreakers have gotten some really important information, and there's a little bit of educated guesswork that goes on, of course, but they have broken through the Japanese transport codes. There have been several diplomatic codes that have been broken, and the Americans are utilizing those from MAGIC, is what I told you before. JN25B is the code that is particularly applicable to Midway, and that Japanese transport code indicates that, in fact, the Americans can know pretty well when the Japanese are going to strike Midway, and they have at least by the morning of June the 4th, they have a good notion of exactly where the Japanese fleet will be. And so the idea for the Japanese was this. The Japanese wanted to strike Midway, and they wanted to draw American forces in and then surprise them and pounce on them. But what the Americans do at Midway is, they kind of reverse the trap a little bit, and they let the Japanese come in, and they let the Japanese air crews sweep in over Midway itself, and they do some of the drawing in, and then they of course pounce, send their air crews against the Japanese fleet that thought it was able to sneak around and be somewhat removed from this particular mode of combat. So from June 4th through June 7th, the Japanese and the Americans fight not only over Midway itself, but these carrier groups, the Japanese carrier group and the American carrier group, strike at one another, and they do immense damage. The United States, by the way, the U.S. gets the Yorktown just prior to the battle, giving the United States 3 carriers to the Japanese. Technically, it's kind of like the Japanese have 4.5 carriers. They're using 4 large strike carriers, and they're using a 5th, which is almost like maybe a half of a carrier. It's a converted battle cruiser that they are using as a landing platform. So it's the Americans versus the Japanese at Midway, with just in the nick of time, the Yorktown making it out of the Puget Sound shipyard with repairs after the Coral Sea battle, and it limps into Midway and takes part in these carrier strikes. A lot of American combat crews paying a very heavy price, as do the Japanese airstrike crews, both the fighters and the bomber crews, striking at the enemy platforms. But here's the critical thing: the Americans, Yorktown is damaged yet again. So the United States loses one carrier and part of another carrier. That is obviously a difficult loss for the United States, but the Japanese lose not 1, not 2, but 3 carriers. Two Japanese carriers are damaged beyond repair. One ultimately is scuttled. another Japanese carrier is deeply damaged and has to be decommissioned for a time and sent into port for repairs. The Japanese losses are stunning for them because they simply do not have the capacity to replace those carriers that they lose at Midway. The Americans, by comparison, are obviously going to suffer some consequences from these losses, but the reality is this: the the American forces are replaced far quicker. There's a greater capacity for replacing lost ships, including aircraft carriers, in these battles. And the Japanese never recover from that loss, to be honest with you. It's one of the critical moments because the entire Japanese strategy in the Western Pacific was to utilize their carrier forces as one of the most critical means of defending their position. And with the loss of their carriers at Midway, their entire strategic situation is deeply compromised, and they suffer from that for the remainder of the war. And I think it's also just an amazing testament to in part American ingenuity, but also dedication, courage. The integration of warfare here is pretty impressive. Not just the combat groups themselves, but also the integration of signal intelligence, or SIGINT. So the code breaking apparatus has a direct role once again in one of the most critical campaigns of the war. So that's Midway of 42. And basically what I've done is I've tried to take us to the end of 1942 in Europe, the end of 1942 in the Pacific, and then we're going to pick up there and continue forward on Friday. All right? Okay, guys, keep up with the reading. Keep to your submission calendar with assignments. We should be able to keep moving with that regardless of whether we're able to be in class or whether we're remote. I am hopeful that we'll be back together in a classroom next week on our regular rotations. So assuming that we are, by the way, let's do this because I have students already asking me. When we come back, let's cross our fingers that that's soon. When we come back, I want to, we started, let's see, we just ended the other day with, so yeah, this is what we'll do. Whenever we come back, I want Group B to be on rotation. So whether we come back on Monday or next Wednesday or next Friday, whenever it will be, we're going to come back with Group B in the classroom and continue from there with our rotations. Okay? Have a good rest of your day, guys. I'll hopefully see you soon, but this should help you stay up to date and have some synthesis to rely on.